let's look at international best practice standards for ethical and social behavior. These are the standards that organizations will use to ensure that their behavior is ethical and socially responsible. When we first look at the complexity of being ethical and socially responsible, it can be overwhelming. In fact, it should be overwhelming. If you see it as something small, you're missing the point. It's huge. So there's lots of management systems out there like ISO 9000, 14001. There's UN guidelines I just talked about. There's codes of conduct for organizations and associations, performance standards, performance reporting standards such as the GRI. So there's all kinds of standards. In fact, when we were developing ISO 26000, we came up with a list of 175 different standards and guidelines that were available to guide people who wanted to be ethical and socially responsible. Now imagine trying to develop your own plan, your own system with that kind of information. So, and that partly was the reason for ISO 26000 to be started in 2004, is to be able to pull together all of these various standards, this 175 standards, and develop a comprehensive guideline that was based on all of these other standards. So when you look at ISO 26000, it was a standard developed by the International Standards Organization to provide guidance on social responsibility. The practical guidance on operationalizing social responsibility, on identifying and engaging with stakeholders, and then finally enhancing credibility of reports and claims about being socially responsible. Now to do that, ISO had to reach out to all of the other organizations that were involved in that same space of developing guidelines or standards for social responsibility. So they had to contact and have an agreement with the International Labour Organization, with the UN Global Compact, or the UN people, with the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation. This ISO standard 26000 had to be consistent with other international treaties and conventions that existed, such as UN declarations and the ILO. And so in developing it, ISO used, and if you look in the bibliography of the standard, of 175 standards, as I mentioned before, and guidelines. Over 500 experts from over 100 countries came together for basically 6 years, 3 times a year meeting and then working between meetings to develop this standard. It's the first time that ISO used a balanced approach in terms of looking at the stakeholders for social responsibility. And so it had to build a committee made up of people that represented labor, people that represented industry, people that represented government, people that represented NGOs, consumers, and others such as academics. I was the industry representative for Canada for those in development of the standard, and Lydia, who spoke earlier on, was the academic representative for Mexico. So the outcome again is the standard that we're talking about today. Now, the standard has 100 pages. How do you use the guidance in a standard that has 100 pages to develop your own system, your own framework, or demonstrate your own commitment to social responsibility? So in my practice, my consulting practice and training and education practice for the last 30 years, I've developed, and my team of experts, in helping organizations develop and implement a framework for governance and social responsibility to be ethical and social responsible and contribute to sustainable development. That's basically my business for 30 years. So I used all of these various standards. Many of the 175 standards I used because my clients wanted to use them or because I felt they were the appropriate standards for them. When ISO started to develop 26000, I looked at and became very active in a section of the standard called Clause 7. which was basically on how to integrate social responsibility throughout the organization. And so when I looked at that clause, I was able to contribute to developing the section, because I felt that's where the essential element of the standard would be, that people would need guidelines on how to implement a system, a structure, a discipline to meet all the criteria to be ethical and social responsible in a way that they could measure their progress and see that they were in fact becoming more ethical and social responsible. So based on my work in countries all over the world in this area, I and the people I work with come up with a framework, 7 phases based on the ISO 26000 standard and based on the phases or the clauses in Clause 7 or the subsection in Clause 7. So they're basically, the first point is to form a sustainability implementation team. Now, that's not in ISO 26000, although I tried to get it in. There was a general consensus that everybody would know that. My own experience, having consulted for 30 years, is people don't know that often the CEO would assign responsibility for implementing a system to one person. So what we recommend is that that's not going to work. If you want people to buy into something as comprehensive as social responsibility, you need a lot of people engaged in the beginning. You need to follow the concept of stakeholder engagement. So the first thing is form a team and make sure the team understands the business case for being ethical and socially responsible. The second thing is that you need to understand the organization and what is the social responsibility of the organization. So phase 2 is to look at what the organization does, all of the activities it does, and then if you think of go back to the definition, accepting responsibility for the impacts of decisions and activities on society and the environment, then you need to know what are the impacts the organization has or could have on society and the environment. And that's a major undertaking. At least 30% of the work in developing your own system is going to be in identifying your social responsibility. The third area then, once you know what your social responsibility is you need to look at practices for integrating social responsibility throughout the organization. Basically, that's going to fall to the area of governance. And so there's many international standards like ISO 9000, 14000, OHSAS 18000 that can be used to help you with those practices, or basically creating the governance framework. So if Clause 2 or Phase 2 in terms of identifying your social responsibility was around identifying the impacts you have or the risks of impact you have, if that was a risk management activity, then Phase 3 is more of a governance framework activity. Then Phase 4, and this is a concept that we believe too, is once you've done that, know the impact you have or could have, and then you have a framework to address that, now you're ready to engage with stakeholders. Identifying stakeholders and then engaging with those stakeholders and listening to what they say. Engaging with them is about listening. And then being able to respond to what they say. Phase 5 then is now you can start communicating your performance. You can start writing your reports, writing your sustainability reports, your CSR reports, using GRI guidelines or IFC or OECD, multinational enterprise guideline. But now you can develop a statement of your social responsibility. So these will be your claims that you can put out to society, to your stakeholders, including your customers, your suppliers. And then Phase 6 is continued improvement, basically. So it's constantly reviewing what you're doing and how you're doing it to look at how you can make it better. And that's got to be a critical aspect. That's where top management are involved in the organization throughout this evaluation. And then Phase 7, the final phase, is verification. Because you're going to need some of your clients or other organizations, maybe regulatory organizations, are going to insist that you verify the claims that you're making about being socially responsible. If you're claiming to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, if you're claiming to operate without accidents or injuries, you're going to have to verify those claims. That's where verification. So verification is a process where you have people evaluate your claims of being socially responsible and then report on how well you're doing at those claims. And that can be done by your own people, it can be done by a third party, or you can have a collection of people, yours, suppliers, customers, etc. So let me drill down in phase two. Basically, phase two is the area where you understand your social responsibility. And to do that, you need to exercise due diligence. So that's about a comprehensive, proactive approach to identify the actual and potential negative social, environmental, and economic impacts of your organization's decisions and activities with the aim of avoiding and mitigating those impacts. So it's basically identifying the impacts of your decisions and activities on society and environment. That's what due diligence is. It also asks you to look at your influence, the influence you have on others, such as suppliers. So it's not enough to just look at your own direct impact or the possible impact you could have. It's what is the impact of your suppliers, of your customers even, of all of the people that you have influence over. Now, what we did in developing the standard is we felt that that was a massive task and would be helped by identifying significant or specific areas that you could look at in determining due diligence. So we come up with what we call the 7 core subjects. So human rights, labor practices, fair operating practices, consumer issues, the environment, community involvement and development. And the 7th then is organizational governance. Now we saw it as a core subject, but it's also affected all of those, because when I go on to talk about what is organizational governance, you see that it is part of all of the other 6 core subjects. So we also looked at, from the stakeholder perspective, is what is the relationship between the organization and its stakeholders and society. So we said those, if you look at society and stakeholders, or you think of impacts that you have on society and the environment, the organization should understand these 3 relationships. The one you have between society and the environment, the one you have between the organization society, the organization environment, and then of course all of your other stakeholders. So we said that between the organization and society, an organization should understand and recognize how its decisions and activities impact the society environment and society's expectations of responsible behavior concerning these impacts by considering the core subjects that we just talked about. Between the organization and its stakeholders, it should be aware of its various stakeholders and understand and be prepared and, in fact, engage with those stakeholders. And then between stakeholders and society, the organization should understand the relationship between stakeholders' interests that are affected by the organization, and on the one hand, and the expectations of society on the other. So we're looking at something now, we're now looking at a very comprehensive approach to being ethical and socially responsible. So that starts with us identifying the issues raised by the impacts. So we need to look at what impact we have. So the impact that we might have on pollution. What are the issues related to that pollution? So where is the pollution? Is it related to air or water or land? And then we need to look at our decision activities as well as the way those issues should be addressed so as to contribute to sustainable development. The second thing is respecting consideration and reconsidering the interest of our stakeholders that are affected by our decisions. Now, if you look at the slide on identifying organizational social responsibility, basically I've combined all of that aspect of being able to do due diligence or being able to identify our social responsibility in this one slide. where I look at considering stakeholders and the sphere of influence that we have. The first area in that is to determine which of the following core subjects. So now I'm looking at all 7 core subjects, and which of those following 7 core subjects and issues might arise when the organization and others within the value chain carry out these activities, taking into account all relevant legislation. Now, basically, to do that, we're looking at identifying all of the activities that the organization is involved in. So if we want to look at the impact of our activities on society and environment, we need to basically list all of the activities. Now, you can imagine a small organization, it's significant work, but a large multinational, it's a huge task to list all the organization and then start looking with the core subjects. You've got the organization on one hand, or the activities table here, and then you've got the 7 core subjects across the top, and you need to look at the issues related to each of those activities. And there's no shortcut, there's no easy way of doing it. You need to look at issues related to each activity and each of the core subjects. And those issues have to be considered while identifying the societal expectations of responsible behavior concerning each of the core subjects and activities. And the third one, you need to examine a range of ways in which the organization's decisions and activities can be a cause of impact on stakeholders and on sustainable development. So, and finally, the fourth is to identify the issues related to those core subjects. So that's the basic activity or work that has to be done in identifying social responsibility. Let me go back to stakeholders, which has, in my own experience, has been something that has not been done well in virtually every organization. So a stakeholder, we define a stakeholder as an individual or group that has an interest in any decision or activity of an organization. So to identify your stakeholders, you have to ask the questions: to whom do legal obligations exist? So who do we have a legal obligation to? Obviously, you have one with regard to the impact on the environment. You have one with contracts that you have to your customers, contracts with employees, contracts with suppliers. Who might be positively or negatively affected by the organization's activity and decision? So that's an activity, a brainstorming activity, where you look at all of your stakeholders, again, people that are affected by or have an interest. And third, who is likely to express concerns about the decisions and activities of the organization? So who are those organizations, such as NGOs or consumers or community members, that might express concern because of pollution or noise or whatever it is? And fourth, who has been involved when similar issues needed to be addressed? So who was involved in the organization, outside? Was it healthcare professionals? Was it regulators? Who was involved when a similar issue had to be addressed? And who can help the organization address these specific issues? So once we have an idea of the stakeholders, who are the stakeholders, the impact we have or could have on them, we need to look at organizational governance. And that's I would say the primary core subject, because it affects all of the other 6 core subjects. So if you look at governance, governance is basically the system by which an organization makes and implements decisions in pursuit of its objectives. So it makes and implements decisions in pursuit of its objectives. So it's the most crucial factor in enabling an organization to take responsibility for the impacts of its decisions and activities on society and environment, and to integrate social responsibility throughout the organization and its relationships. It's the primary objective there. It's directed by a person or a group of persons having the authority and responsibility for pursuing the organization's objectives. And third, it incorporates the principles and practices of accountability, transparency, ethical behavior, respect for stakeholder interests, and respect for the rule of law into the decision-making processes and implementation of the organization. When you think of the organization governance, I've defined what it is, but we need to look at our own organizations and ask these following questions. First, does your organization know, for itself and for those that it has influence, does it know and accept responsibility for the impacts that it has? The second, does it give bad news with good? So if it knows that it has had a spill, does it tell the right people? If it knows that something has gone wrong, does it report it? If it knows it's not in conformance or compliance with laws, does it make that information available, even in its sustainability report? And does it cause no harm to stakeholders? Or if it does it have a process? Number 4, to have a formal approach to listen and respond to stakeholder expectations. And finally, does it know and comply with laws and regulations? Now, if the answer was yes, and there was a framework, a governance framework, to be able to demonstrate that the answer was truly yes, then you have the framework that's needed. The second core subject we need to look at is human rights. This is a massive one that it's critical and at issue in virtually every country, in every organization, because we take it for granted. We take for granted that we will meet people's human rights, but often we don't know them. So if you look at human rights, the issues related to human rights, there's going to be an issue of due diligence, one of human rights risk situation, avoidance of complicity, resolving grievances related to human rights, discrimination with regard to vulnerable groups, civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, and finally the fundamental principles and rights at work. So the UN Declaration for Human Rights says that human beings are entitled to the right to life and liberty, equality before the law and freedom of expression, the right to work, the right to food, the right to the highest attainable standard of health, and the right to education, and the right to social security. When you think of that and you look at what does that mean, for an organization then, you need to ask the questions related to your own governance related to human rights. And so those questions are, does your organization and those organizations that it has influence over know the rights and risks of harm to your stakeholders, civil, political, social, economic, and cultural rights? Have you gone through that analysis? Number 2, do you respect the rights of all stakeholders? That means you have to know what are the rights of this different stakeholders. So if your employees, for instance, if you don't know their rights, and their rights, if you look at the list that I have, their rights to participate in terms of having a say in what they do, their rights to be for respect, their rights for education. So what are the impacts you have on those rights, or could have? Even right on the rights to be able to worship in their own religion. If you don't know their right there, for instance, if you don't know what their religion is, you may not know that they worship on a Sunday, so that's not a good day for them, or they may worship on Friday or Saturday. So you need to know even something as simple as their rights for worship. You need to know the respect fundamental rights at work. What are those rights that they have at work? And you need to give the employees a say in what they do, or not discriminate against employees and clients in terms of hiring, in terms of who you will accept as a client. And then you need to celebrate people with special needs, people that are in vulnerable groups.